Abkhazia, officially the Republic of Abkhazia, is a partially recognized state in the South Caucasus that sits on the eastern coast of the Black Sea, at the intersection of Eastern Europe and West Asia. It covers 8,665 square kilometers and has a population of around 245,000. Its capital and largest city is Sukhumi. The political status of Abkhazia is the central issue of the Abkhazia conflict and Georgia-Russia relations. Having unilaterally declared independence from Georgia in 1992, Abkhazia is formally recognized as an independent state only by 5 UN member states. 2 other states previously recognized it, but then withdrew their recognition: Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Nauru, and Syria. The remainder of the international community recognizes Abkhazia as the jure part of Georgia. Lacking effective control over the Abkhazian territory, Georgia maintains an Abkhaz government in exile. The region had autonomy as the Abkhaz Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic within the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic at the time when the Soviet Union began to disintegrate in the late 1980s. Simmering ethnic tensions between the Abkhaz, the region's titular ethnicity, and Georgians, the largest single ethnic group at that time, culminated in the 1992 to 1993 war in Abkhazia, which resulted in Georgia's loss of control over most of Abkhazia, followed by Abkhazia independence and the ethnic cleansing of Georgians from Abkhazia. Despite a 1994 ceasefire agreement and years of negotiations, the dispute remains unresolved. The long-term presence of a United Nations observer mission and a Russian-led Commonwealth of Independent States peacekeeping force failed to prevent the flare-up of violence on several occasions. In August 2008, Abkhaz and Russian forces fought the Russo-Georgian War against Georgian forces, which led to the formal recognition of Abkhazia by Russia, the annulment of the 1994 ceasefire agreement, and the termination of a UN mission. On October 23, 2008, the Parliament of Georgia declared Abkhazia a Russian-occupied territory. Etymology: the Abkhaz name Apsny is etymologized as a land of the soul. However, the literal meaning is a country of mortals. It possibly first appeared in the 7th century in an Armenian text, perhaps referring to the ancient Absilians. In early Muslim sources, the term Abkhazia was generally used to mean the territory of Georgia. Presumably considered as a successor of the Kingdom of Lazika, Egrisi in Georgian sources, this new polity continued to be referred to as Egrisi in some Byzantine-era Georgian and Armenian chronicles, e.g. The Vitae of the Georgian Kings by Leonie Mraveli and History of Armenia by Havanes Draskinakurtsi. The Constitution of Abkhazia says the names of the Republic of Abkhazia and Apsny are equivalent and interchangeable. Before the 20th century, the region was sometimes referred to in English-language sources as Abkhazia. History. Early history. Between the 9th and 6th centuries BC, the territory of modern Abkhazia was part of the ancient kingdom of Caucasus. Around the 6th century BC, the Greeks established trade colonies along the Black Sea coast of present-day Abkhazia, in particular at Pidient and Dioscurias. Classical authors described various peoples living in the region and the great multitude of languages they spoke. Arrian, Pliny, and Strabo have given accounts of the Abasgoi and Mozchoi, people somewhere in modern Abkhazia on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. This region was subsequently absorbed in 63 BC into the Kingdom of Lazika. According to an Easter tradition, Simon the Zealot died in Abkhazia during a missionary trip and was buried in Nicopolis. His mortal remains were later transferred to Anacopia, within the Roman and Byzantine empires. The Roman Empire conquered Lazica in the 1st century AD. However, the Roman presence was confined to port cities. According to Arrian, the Abasgoi and Apsali peoples were nominal Roman subjects, and there was a small Roman outpost in Dioscurias. Abasgoi likely served in the Roman army in Alla Prima Abasgorum, which was stationed in Egypt. After the 4th century, Lazica regained a measure of independence, but remained within the Byzantine Empire's sphere of influence. Anacopia was the principality's capital. The country was mostly Christian, with the archbishop's seat in Pityus. Stratophilus, the metropolitan of Pityus, participated in the First Council of Nicaea in 325. Around the middle of the 6th century AD, the Byzantines and the neighboring Sassanid Persia fought for supremacy over Abkhazia, a conflict known as the Lazark War. During the war, the Abkhasians revolted against the Byzantine Empire and requested Sasanian assistance. The revolt was suppressed by General Bessus. An Arab incursion into Abkhazia, led by Marwan II, was repelled by Prince Leon I jointly with his Lazark and Iberian allies in 736. Leon I then married Mirian's daughter and a successor. King Leon II exploited this dynastic union to acquire Lazica in the 770s. The successful defense against the Arab Caliphate and new territorial gains in the east gave the Abkhasian princes enough power to claim more autonomy from the Byzantine Empire. Circa 778, Prince Leon II, with the help of the Khazars, declared independence from the Byzantine Empire and transferred his residence to Kutaisi. During this period, the Georgian language replaced Greek as the language of literacy and culture. Within the Kingdom of Georgia, the Kingdom of Abkhazia flourished between 850 and 950 AD, which ended by unification of Abkhazia and Eastern Georgian states under a single Georgian monarchy ruled by King Bagrat III at the end of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th century. During the reign of Queen Tamar, Georgian chronicles mention Otego as the Aristavi of Abkhazia. He was one of the first representatives of the House of Shirvashids, also known as Chachba, which went on to rule Abkhazia until the 19th century. In the 1240s, Mongols divided Georgia into 8 military administrative sectors, Tumans. The territory of contemporary Abkhazia formed part of the Tuman administered by Tsatna Dadiani. Ottoman influence. In the 16th century, after the breakup of the Georgian kingdom into small kingdoms and principalities, the Principality of Abkhazia, nominally a vassal of the Kingdom of Imereti, emerged, ruled by the Shirvashids dynasty, in 1453. The Ottomans first attacked Sukhumi, and in the 1570s, they had a garrison there. Throughout the 17th century, they continued to launch attacks, leading to the imposition of tribute on Abkhazia. Ottoman influence grew significantly in the 18th century with the construction of a fort in Sukhumi, accompanied by conversion of the rulers of Abkhazia and many other Abkhaz to Islam. Nonetheless, conflicts between the Abkhaz and Turks persisted. The spread of Islam in Abkhazia was first evidenced by the Ottoman traveler of Leah Shalebi in 1641. Despite this, the Islamization was more evident in the higher levels of society rather than the general population. In his work, Shalebi also wrote that the principal tribe of Abkhazian Principality, Chach, spoke Mingrelian language, a subset of Kartvelian, Georgian, languages. Abkhazia sought protection from the Russian Empire in 1801, but was declared an autonomous principality by the Russians in 1810. Russia then annexed Abkhazia in 1864, and Abkhaz resistance was quashed as the Russians deported Muslim Abkhaz to Ottoman territories. Within Russia, in the beginning of the 19th century, while the Russians and Ottomans were vying for control of the region, the rulers of Abkhazia shifted back and forth across the religious divide. The first attempt to enter into relations with Russia was made by Prince Kalesh Bey in 1803, shortly after the incorporation of eastern Georgia into the expanding Tsarist Empire in 1801. However, pro-Ottoman sympathy in Abkhazia prevailed for a short time after Kalesh Bey was assassinated by his son, Aslan Bey, in 1801. On July 2, 1810, Russian Marines stormed Sukhumkale and had Aslan Bey replaced with his rival and brother, Sefer Ali Bey, who had converted to Christianity and assumed the name of George. Abkhazia joined the Russian Empire as an autonomous principality. In 1810, however, Sefer Bey's rule was limited and many mountain regions were as independent as before. Sefer Bey ruled from 1810 to 1821, the next Russo-Turkish War. 1828 to 1829 strongly enhanced the Russian positions, leading to a further split in the Abkhaz elite, mainly along religious divisions. During the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, Russian forces had to evacuate Abkhazia, and Prince Hamid Bey, Shirvashid's Chachba, Mikhail, who ruled from 1822 to 1864, seemingly switched to the Ottomans. Later on, The Russian presence strengthened, and the highlanders of Western Caucasia were finally subjugated by Russia in 1864. The autonomy of Abkhazia, which had functioned as a pro-Russian buffer zone in this troublesome region, was no longer needed by the Tsar's government, and the rule of the Sharvashids came to an end. In November 1864, Prince Mikhail, Hamid Bey, was forced to renounce his rights and resettle in Voronezh, Russia. Later that same year, Abkhazia was incorporated into the Russian Empire as a special military province of Sukhumkale, which was transformed in 1883 into an okrug as part of the Kutaisi Governorate. Large numbers of Muslim Abkhazians, said to have constituted as much as 40% of the Abkhazian population, immigrated to the Ottoman Empire between 1864 and 1878 together with other Muslim populations of the Caucasus, a process known as Muhajirism. Large areas of the region were left uninhabited, and many Armenians, Georgians, Russians, and others subsequently migrated to Abkhazia, resettling much of the vacated territory. Some Georgian historians assert that Georgian tribes, Svans and Mingrelians, had populated Abkhazia since the time of the Caucasus Kingdom, by official decision of the Russian authorities. The residents of Abkhazia and Samarkand had to study and pray in Russian. After the mass deportation of 1878, Abkhazians were left in the minority, officially branded guilty people, and had no leader capable of mounting serious opposition to Russification. On March 17, 1898, the Synodal Department of the Russian Orthodox Church of Georgia Meridi, by Order 2771, again prohibited teaching and the conduct of religious services in Georgian. Mass protests by the Georgian population of Abkhazia and Samarkand followed, news of which reached the Russian Emperor. On September 3, 1898, the Holy Synod issued Order 4880, which decreed that those parishes where the congregation was Mingrelian, i.e. Georgian, conduct both church services and church education in Georgian, while Abkhazian parishes use Old Slavic. In the Sukhumi district, this order was carried out in only 3 of 42 parishes. Tito Sokokia demanded the Russian authorities introduce Abkhazian and Georgian languages in church services and education. The official response was a criminal case brought against Tito Sokokia and leaders of his Georgian party, active in Abkhazia, within the Georgian Democratic Republic. Following the October Revolution in Russia, the Transcaucasian Commissariat was set up in southern Caucasus, which gradually took steps towards the independence. Transcaucasia declared its independence from Russia on April 9, 1918, as a federative republic. On May 8, 1918, the Bolsheviks seized power in Abkhazia and disbanded the local Abkhaz People's Council. It requested aid from the Transcaucasian authorities, which dispatched the Georgian People's Guard and defeated the rebels on May 17. On May 26, 1918, Georgia declared independence from the Transcaucasian Federation, which dissolved on May 28. On June 8, 1918, the Abkhaz People's Council signed a treaty with the Georgian National Council, which confirmed Abkhazia's status as an autonomy within the Georgian Democratic Republic. The Georgian army defeated another Bolshevik rebellion in the region. It remained part of Georgia after another Bolshevik revolt and a Turkish expedition were defeated in 1918. The Russian general and a leader of white movement Anton Denikin laid claims on Abkhazia and captured Gagra. But the Georgians counterattacked in April 1919 and retook the city. The Denikin's volunteer army was eventually defeated by the Red Army. And Bolshevik Russia signed an agreement with Georgia in May 1920, recognizing Abkhazia as a part of Georgia. In 1919, a first election was held to the Abkhaz People's Council. The council favored being an autonomous region within Georgia, and it lasted until the Red Army invasion of Georgia in February 1921. On March 20, 1919, the newly elected Abkhazian People's Council adopted the Act on Abkhazian Autonomy, which formalized the establishment of the Abkhazian autonomy within the Georgian Democratic Republic, within the Soviet Union. In 1921, the Bolshevik Red Army invaded Georgia and ended its short-lived independence. Abkhazia was made a Socialist Soviet Republic, SSR Abkhazia, with the ambiguous status of a treaty republic associated with the Georgian SSR. Under the Korenizatsiya policy of the Soviet Union, the Abkhaz people were not considered as the advanced people and thus saw an increased focus on their national language and cultural development. Under this policy, the Abkhaz received various benefits, such as schooling in their language. The official literary language was established for the first time. Between 1922 and 1926, the share of Abkhaz increased from 19.8% to 27.8% of the population, possibly due to the immigration of ethnic Abkhaz from Turkey or re-identification as Abkhaz. Their share among the members of the local Communist Party grew from 10% to the 25%. Meanwhile, the proportion of ethnic Georgian population decreased from 42% in 1922 to 36% in 1926, while their proportion in the local Communist Party also decreased from 40% to 33%. In 1931, Joseph Stalin made it an autonomous republic, Abkhazia SSR. Within the Georgian SSR. In the terror of 1937 to 38, the ruling elite was purged of Abkhaz, and by 1952, over 80% of the 228 top party and government officials and enterprise managers were ethnic Georgians. There remained 34 Abkhaz, 7 Russians, and 3 Armenians in these positions. Georgian Communist Party leader Candid Charkviani supported the Georgianization of Abkhazia. Starting from 1939, peasant households from the rest of the Georgian SSR were resettled to Abkhazia, which changed its demographic makeup significantly. The publishing of materials in Abkhazian dwindled and was eventually stopped altogether. Abkhaz schools were closed in 1945 to 1946, requiring Abkhaz children to study in the Georgian language. This was part of the change in the general Soviet and Stalinist policy of national consolidation carried out in all Soviet republics to assimilate the ethnic minorities into titular nationalities, which would in the end be assimilated into the Soviet people under the lead of elder brother Russians in the pyramid of assimilation. The teaching of Abkhaz language was preserved in the new reorganized Abkhaz schools as a mandatory subject by the decision of the Georgian Communist Party. The policy of repression was eased after Stalin's death and Beria's execution, and the Abkhaz were given a greater role in the governance of the Republic AS in most of the smaller autonomous republics. The Soviet government encouraged the development of culture and particularly of literature. The Abkhazian SSR was the only autonomous republic in the USSR in which the language of the titular nation, in that case Abkhazian, was confirmed in its constitution as one of its official languages. Their share among the members of the local Communist Party grew from 10% to the 25%. In the post-war period, the Abkhazian ASSR was dominated by the ethnic Abkhaz, who occupied many more positions in the autonomous republic compared to Georgians. During the late Soviet period, ethnic Abkhaz occupied 41% of the seats in Abkhazian Supreme Soviet, and 67% of the Republican ministers were ethnically Abkhaz. Moreover, they held even larger proportion of lower-level official posts within the autonomous republic. The first secretary of the Communist Party in Abkhazia was also ethnically Abkhaz. All of this was despite the fact that Abkhazians made up only 17.8% of the region's population, while Georgians were 45.7%, and other ethnicities, Greeks, Russians, Armenians, etc., 36.5%. Post-Soviet Georgia. As the Soviet Union began to disintegrate at the end of the 1980s, ethnic tensions grew between the Abkhaz and Georgians over Georgia's moves towards independence. Many Abkhaz opposed this, fearing that an independent Georgia would lead to the elimination of their autonomy, and argued instead for the establishment of Abkhazia as a separate Soviet republic in its own right. With the onset of perestroika, the agenda of Abkhaz nationalists became more radical and exclusive. In 1988, they began to ask for the reinstatement of Abkhazia's former status of Union Republic, as the submission of Abkhazia to another Union Republic was not considered to give enough guarantees of their development. They justified their request by referring to the Leninist tradition of the right of nations to self-determination, which they asserted was violated when Abkhazia's sovereignty was curtailed in 1931 in June 1988, a manifesto defending Abkhaz distinctiveness, known as the Abkhazian Letter, was sent to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The Georgian-Abkhaz dispute turned violent on July 16, 1989 in Sukhumi. Numerous Georgians were killed or injured when they tried to enroll in a Georgian university instead of an Abkhaz one. After several days of violence, Soviet troops restored order in the city. In March 1990, Georgia declared sovereignty, unilaterally nullifying treaties concluded by the Soviet government since 1921 and thereby moving closer to independence. The Republic of Georgia boycotted the March 17, 1991 all-union referendum on the renewal of the Soviet Union called by Gorbachev. However, 52.3% of Abkhazia's population, almost all of the ethnic non-Georgian population, took part in the referendum and voted by an overwhelming majority, 98.6%, to preserve the Union. Most ethnic non-Georgians in Abkhazia later boycotted a March 31st referendum on Georgia's independence, which was supported by a huge majority of Georgia's population. Within weeks, Georgia declared independence on April 9, 1991, under former Soviet dissident Zviad Gamsakhurdia. Under Gamsakhurdia, the situation was relatively calm in Abkhazia, and a power-sharing agreement was soon reached between the Abkhaz and Georgian factions, granting to the Abkhaz a certain overrepresentation in the local legislature. Gamsakhurdia's rule was soon challenged by armed opposition groups under the command of Tengiz Kitovani that forced him to flee the country in a military coup in January 1992. Gamsakhurdia was replaced by former Soviet Georgian leader and Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, who became the country's head of state that on February 21, 1992, Georgia's ruling military council announced that it was abolishing the Soviet-era constitution and restoring the 1921 Constitution of the Democratic Republic of Georgia. Many Abkhaz interpreted this as an abolition of their autonomous status, although the 1921 Constitution contained a provision for the region's autonomy. But on July 23, 1992, the Abkhaz faction in the Republic's Supreme Council declared effective independence from Georgia, although the session was boycotted by ethnic Georgian deputies and the gesture went unrecognized by any other country. The Abkhaz leadership launched a campaign of ousting Georgian officials from their offices, a process which was accompanied by violence. In the meantime, the Abkhaz leader Vladislav Ardzinba intensified his ties with hardline Russian politicians and military elite and declared he was ready for a war with Georgia. To respond to this situation, Eduard Shevardnadze, new leader of Georgia, had interrupted his trip to Western Georgia, where the Georgian Civil War had been going on between his government and supporters of former President Zviad Gamsakhurdia, ousted during the December 1991 coup. Shevardnadze announced that the Abkhaz faction took the decision without considering the opinion of the majority of population in Abkhazia. War in Abkhazia. In August 1992, war broke out when the National Guard of Georgia entered Abkhazia. The declared goal was to free Georgian officials held captive in Abkhazia and to reopen the railway line running through Abkhazia to the rest of Georgia, which was frequently robbed. According to Daryl Slider, Abkhaz troops were the first to open fire. Abkhaz separatist government retreated to Gadada, where the Russian military base was located. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reported the ethnic-based violence against Georgians in Gadada. The Abkhaz were relatively unarmed at the time, and the Georgian troops were able to march into the capital Sukhumi with relatively little resistance, and subsequently engaged in ethnically based pillage, looting, assault, and murder. The Abkhaz military defeat was met with a hostile response by the self-styled Confederation of Mountain Peoples of the Caucasus, an umbrella group uniting a number of movements in the North Caucasus, including elements of Circassians, Abkhazans, Chechens, Cossacks, Ossetians, and hundreds of volunteer paramilitaries and mercenaries from Russia, including the then little-known Shamil Basayev, later a leader of the anti-Moscow Chechen secessionists. They sided with the Abkhaz separatists to fight against the Georgian government. Russian military did not impede the crossing of the Russia-Georgia border by the North Caucasian militants into Abkhazia. In the case of Basayev, It has been suggested that when he and the members of his battalion came to Abkhazia, they received training by the Russian army, though others dispute this. Presenting another possible motive on September 25, 1992, Russian Supreme Council, Parliament, passed a resolution which condemned Georgia, supported Abkhazia, and called for the suspension of the delivery of any weapons and equipment to Georgia and the deployment of a Russian peacekeeping force in Abkhazia. It was sponsored by a Russian nationalist politician, Sergei Baburin, a Russian deputy who met Vladislav Ardzinba and argued that he was not that much sure that Abkhazia was part of Georgia. In October, the Abkhaz and North Caucasian paramilitaries mounted a major offensive against Gagra after breaking a ceasefire, which drove the Georgian forces out of large swathes of the republic. Shevardnadzi's government accused Russia of giving covert military support to the rebels with the aim of detaching from Georgia, its native territory, and the Georgia-Russian frontier land. 1992 ended with the rebels in control of much of Abkhazia northwest of Sukhumi. The conflict was in stalemate until July 1993, when Abkhaz separatist militias launched an abortive attack on Georgian-held Sukhumi. They surrounded and heavily shelled the capital, where Shevardnadze was trapped. The warring sides agreed to a Russian-brokered truce in Sochi at the end of July. But the ceasefire broke down again on September 16, 1993. Abkhaz forces, with armed support from outside Abkhazia, launched attacks on Sukhumi and Akamshire. Notwithstanding UN Security Council's call for the immediate cessation of hostilities and its condemnation of the violation of the ceasefire by the Abkhaz side, fighting continued. After 10 days of heavy fighting, Sukhumi was taken by Abkhazian forces on September 27, 1993. Shevardnadze narrowly escaped death after vowing to stay in the city no matter what. He changed his mind, however, and decided to flee when separatist snipers fired on the hotel where he was staying. Abkhaz, North Caucasian militants, and their allies committed numerous atrocities against the city's remaining ethnic Georgians in what has been dubbed the Sukhumi Massacre. The mass killings and destruction continued for 2 weeks, leaving thousands dead and missing. The Abkhaz forces quickly overran the rest of Abkhazia as the Georgian government faced a second threat: an uprising by the supporters of the deposed Zviad Gamsakhurdia in the region of Mingrelia, Samegrelo. Only a small region of eastern Abkhazia, the Upper Kodary Gorge, remained under Georgian control until 2008. During the war, gross human rights violations were reported on both sides. See Human Rights Watch report. Georgian troops have been accused of having committed looting and murders for the purpose of terrorizing, robbing, and driving the Abkhaz population out of their homes in the first phase of the war, according to Human Rights Watch. While Georgia blames the Abkhaz forces and their allies for the ethnic cleansing of Georgians in Abkhazia, which has also been recognized by the organization. For security and cooperation in Europe, OSCE summits in Budapest, 1994, Lisbon, 1996, and Istanbul, 1999. Ethnic cleansing of Georgians. Before the 1992 war in Abkhazia, Georgians made up nearly half of Abkhazia's population. While less than 1/5 of the population was Abkhaz, as the war progressed, confronted with hundreds of thousands of ethnic Georgians who were unwilling to leave their homes, the Abkhaz separatists implemented the process of ethnic cleansing in order to expel and eliminate the Georgian ethnic population in Abkhazia. About 5,000 were killed, 400 went missing, and up to 250,000 ethnic Georgians were expelled from their homes, according to International Crisis Group. As of 2006, slightly over 200,000 Georgians remained displaced in Georgia proper. The campaign of ethnic cleansing also included Russians, Armenians, Greeks, moderate Abkhaz, and other minor ethnic groups living in Abkhazia. More than 20,000 houses owned by ethnic Georgians were destroyed. Hundreds of schools, kindergartens, churches, hospitals, and historical monuments were pillaged and destroyed. Following the process of ethnic cleansing and mass expulsion, the population of Abkhazia was reduced from 525,000 in 1989 to 216,000 in 2012. The pogroms against ethnic Georgians organized by Abkhaz leaders continued even after the end of war. As late as February 1995. Of about 250,000 Georgian refugees, some 60,000 subsequently returned to Abkhazia's Gali district between 1994 and 1998, but tens of thousands were displaced again when fighting resumed in the Gali district in 1998. Nevertheless, between 40,000 and 60,000 refugees have returned to the Gali district since 1998, including persons commuting daily across the ceasefire line and those migrating seasonally in accordance with agricultural cycles. The human rights situation remained precarious for a while in the Georgian populated areas of the Gali district. The United Nations and other international organizations have been fruitlessly urging the Abkhaz de facto authorities to refrain from adopting measures incompatible with the right to return and with international human rights standards, such as discriminatory legislation, and to cooperate in the establishment of a permanent international human rights office in Gali, and to admit United Nations civilian police without further delay. Key officials of the Gali district are virtually all ethnic Abkhaz, though their support staff are ethnic Georgian. Post-war, presidential elections were held in Abkhazia on October 3, 2004. Russia supported Raul Kajimba, the prime minister backed by the ailing, outgoing separatist president Vladislav Ardzinba. Posters of Russia's President Vladimir Putin together with Kajimba, who like Putin had worked as a KGB official, were everywhere in Sukhumi. Deputies of Russia's parliament and Russian singers, led by Joseph Kasson, a State Duma deputy and a popular singer, came to Abkhazia, campaigning for Kajimba. However, Kajimba lost the elections to Sergei Bagapsh. The tense situation in the republic led to the cancellation of the election results by the Supreme Court. After that, a deal was struck between former rivals to run jointly, with Bagapsh as a presidential candidate and Kajimba as a vice presidential candidate. They received more than 90% of the votes in the new election. In July 2006, Georgian forces launched a successful police operation against the rebelled administrator of the Georgian-populated Kodary Valley, Emzur Kvitsiani. Kvitsiani had been appointed by the previous president of Georgia, Eduard Shevardnadze, and refused to recognize the authority of President Mikhail Saakashvili, who succeeded Shevardnadze after the Rose Revolution. Although Kvitsiani escaped capture by Georgian police, the Kodary Gorge was brought back under the control of the central government in Tbilisi. Sporadic acts of violence continued throughout the post-war years. Despite the peacekeeping status of the Russian peacekeepers in Abkhazia, Georgian officials routinely claimed that Russian peacekeepers were inciting violence by supplying Abkhaz rebels with arms and financial support. Russian support of Abkhazia became pronounced when the Russian ruble became the de facto currency and Russia began issuing passports to the population of Abkhazia. Georgia has also accused Russia of violating its airspace by sending helicopters to attack Georgian-controlled towns in the Kodary Gorge. In April 2008, a Russian MiG prohibited from Georgian airspace, including Abkhazia, shot down a Georgian UAV. On August 9, 2008, Abkhazian forces fired on Georgian forces in Kodary Gorge. This coincided with the 2008 South Ossetia War, where Russia decided to support the Ossetian separatists who had been attacked by Georgia. The conflict escalated into a full-scale war between the Russian Federation and the Republic of Georgia. On August 10, 2008, an estimated 9,000 Russian soldiers entered Abkhazia, ostensibly to reinforce the Russian peacekeepers in the Republic. About 1,000 Abkhazian soldiers moved to expel the residual Georgian forces within Abkhazia in the upper Kodary Gorge. By August 12th, the Georgian forces and civilians had evacuated the last part of Abkhazia under Georgian government control. Russia recognized the independence of Abkhazia on 26 August 2008. This was followed by the annulment of the 1994 ceasefire agreement and the termination of UN and OSCE monitoring missions that on August 28, 2008, the Parliament of Georgia passed a resolution declaring Abkhazia a Russian-occupied territory. Since independence was recognized by Russia, a series of controversial agreements were made between the Abkhazian government and the Russian Federation that leased or sold a number of key state assets and relinquished control over the borders. In May 2009, several opposition parties and war veteran groups protested against these deals, complaining that they undermined state sovereignty and risked exchanging one colonial power, Georgia, for another, Russia. The vice president, Raul Kajimba, resigned on May 28, saying he agreed with the criticism the opposition had made. Subsequently, a conference of opposition parties nominated Raul Kajimba as their candidate in the December 2009 Abkhazian presidential election, won by Sergei Bagapsh. Political developments since 2014. In the spring of 2014, the opposition submitted an ultimatum to President Alexander Ankvab to dismiss the government and make radical reforms. On May 27, 2014, in the center of Sukhumi, 10,000 supporters of the Abkhaz opposition gathered for a mass demonstration that on the same day. Ankvab's headquarters in Sukhumi was stormed by opposition groups led by Raul Kajimba, forcing him in a flight to Gadada. The opposition claimed that the protests were sparked by poverty, but the main point of contention was President Ankvab's liberal policy towards ethnic Georgians in the Gali region. The opposition said these policies could endanger Abkhazia's ethnic Abkhazian identity. After Ankvab fled the capital on May 31st, the People's Assembly of Abkhazia appointed Parliamentary Speaker Valery Gamba as acting president, declaring Ankvab unable to serve. It also decided to hold an early presidential election on August 24, 2014. Ankvab soon declared his formal resignation, although he accused his opponents of acting immorally and violating the constitution. Raul Kajimba was later elected president, taking office in September 2014. In November 2014, Vladimir Putin moved to formalize the Abkhazian military's relationship as part of the Russian armed forces, signing a treaty with Kajimba. The Georgian government denounced the agreement as a step towards annexation. Kajimba was re-elected with a margin of less than 2% in 2019. In January 2020, the Abkhazian Supreme Court annulled the results. Following protests against Kajimba, Kajimba resigned the presidency on January 12th, and new elections were called for 22 March. Aslan Bazania was elected in the subsequent elections with around 59% of the vote. In December 2021, there was an unrest. Protests took place in November 2024 after the arrest of 5 opposition activists who opposed an investment agreement with Russia, which led to the resignation of then-President Aslan Bazania, and a new presidential election in February 2025 that acting President Badr Gunba was elected, receiving 56% of the vote. Russia took an unprecedented role in meddling in the 2025 elections, according to analysts. Geography. Abkhazia covers an area of about 8,665 square kilometers, 3,346 square miles, at the western end of Georgia. The Caucasus Mountains to the north and northeast separate Abkhazia and the Russian Federation. To the east and southeast, Abkhazia is bounded by the Georgian region of Samogrelo-Zemo-Svaneti, and on the south and southwest by the Black Sea. Abkhazia is diverse geographically with lowlands stretching to the extremely mountainous north. The Greater Caucasus Mountain Range runs along the region's northern border with its spurs, the Gagra, BZYB, and Kotori ranges, dividing the area into a number of deep, well-watered valleys. The highest peaks of Abkhazia are in the northeast and east, and several exceed 4,000 meters, 13,123 feet, above sea level. Abkhazia's landscape ranges from coastal forests and citrus plantations to permanent snows and glaciers in the north of the region. Although Abkhazia's complex topographic setting has spared most of the territory from significant human development, its cultivated fertile lands produce tea, tobacco, wine, and fruits, a mainstay of the local agricultural sector. Abkhazia is richly irrigated by small rivers originating in the Caucasus Mountains. Chief of these are Kotori, BZYB, Galidzga, and Gamista. The Pso River separates the region from Russia, and the Inguri serves as a boundary between Abkhazia and Georgia proper. There are several periglacial and crater lakes in mountainous Abkhazia. Lake Ritsa is the most important of them. Because of Abkhazia's proximity to the Black Sea and the shield of the Caucasus Mountains, the region's climate is very mild. The coastal areas of the republic have a subtropical climate, where the average annual temperature in most regions is around 15 degrees Celsius 59 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average January temperature remains above freezing. The climate at higher elevations varies from maritime mountainous to cold and summerless. Also, due to its position on the windward slopes of the Caucasus, Abkhazia receives high amounts of precipitation, though humidity decreases further inland. The annual precipitation varies from 1,200 to 1,400 millimeters, 47.2 to 55.1 in, along the coast to 1,700 to 3,500 millimeters, 66.9 to 137.8 in the higher mountainous areas. The mountains of Abkhazia receive significant amounts of snow. The world's deepest known cave, Veryovkina Cave, is located in Abkhazia's western Caucasus Mountains. The latest survey, as of March 2018, has measured the vertical extent of this cave system as 2,212 meters, 7,257 feet, between its highest and lowest explored points. The lowland regions used to be covered by swaths of oak, beech, and hornbeam, which have since been cleared. There are two main entrances into Abkhazia: government and politics. Republic of Abkhazia. Abkhazia is a presidential republic. Legislative powers are vested in the People's Assembly, which consists of 35 elected members. The last parliamentary elections were held in March 2022. Ethnicities other than Abkhaz, Armenians, Russians, and Georgians, are claimed to be underrepresented in the assembly. Most refugees from the 1992 to 1993 war, mainly ethnic Georgians, have not been able to return and have thus been excluded from the political process. 166, some refugees have been allowed to return, in particular in the Gali district, where 98% of the population is Georgian, as it was before the ethnic cleansing. However, they have been stripped of the voting and other rights. As such, during the 2021 local elections, only 900 eligible voters were registered in the Gali district, despite the 30,259 residents in the area. The territory of the Gali district has also been diminished through addition of some of its lands to Kvarchly and Akamchar districts. Russia has a major military and economic presence in Abkhazia, and the relationship between the two has been described as asymmetrical, with Abkhazia being heavily dependent on Russia. Half of Abkhazia's budget comes from Russian funding, with most of financial aid coming in the form of loans. Much of its state structure is integrated with Russia. It uses the Russian ruble. Its foreign policy is coordinated with Russia, and a majority of its citizens have Russian passports as a result of Russia's passportization policy. Abkhazia has adopted Russian technical and commercial standards, and large part of its infrastructure is owned by Russian companies, with Russia heavily investing in the military infrastructure. The 2014 Treaty on Alliance and Strategic Partnership obliges Abkhazia to coordinate its foreign policy with Russia and merge the armed forces. As such, under pressure from Russia, Abkhazia joined Russia in imposing sanctions on Turkey in 2016, becoming Russia's only ally to do so. Abkhazian officials have stated that they have given the Russian Federation the responsibility of representing their interests abroad. Some have described Abkhazia as Russia's protectorate with a strong and one-sided dependence. According to a 2010 study published by the University of Colorado Boulder, the vast majority of Abkhazia's population supports independence, while a smaller number is in favor of joining the Russian Federation. Support for reunification with Georgia is very low. Among ethnic Abkhaz, explicit support for reunification with Georgia is around 1%. A similar figure can be found among ethnic Russians and Armenians as well. Harmonization of laws with Russia. In 2014, Separatist Republic of Abkhazia and Russian Federation signed the Treaty of Alliance and Strategic Partnership with Russia. Based on this treaty, in November 2020, Abkhazia launched a program on the formation of common social and economic space with Russia to make Abkhaz laws and administrative measures more similar to Russian ones in social, economic, health, and political spheres. And on August 15, 2024, The Russian Deputy Minister of Economic Development, Dmitry Volvok, said that the process of Abkhazia's harmonization of its laws with Russia was almost complete. Autonomous Republic of Abkhazia. The government of the Autonomous Republic of Abkhazia is the government in exile that Georgia recognizes as the legal government of Abkhazia. This pro-Georgian government maintained a foothold on Abkhazian territory in the Upper Kodary Valley from July 2006 until it was forced out by fighting in August 2008. This government is also partly responsible for the affairs of some 250,000 IDPs forced to leave Abkhazia following the war in Abkhazia and ethnic cleansing that followed. The current head of the government is Vakhtang Kolbaya. During the war in Abkhazia, the government of the Autonomous Republic of Abkhazia, at the time the Georgian faction of the Council of Ministers of Abkhazia, left Abkhazia after the Abkhaz separatist forces took control of the region's capital Sukhumi and relocated to Georgia's capital Tbilisi, where it operated as the government of Abkhazia in exile for almost 13 years. During this period, the government of Abkhazia in exile, led by Tamaz Netarashvili, was known for a hardline stance towards the Abkhaz problem and frequently voiced their opinion that the solution to the conflict can be attained only through Georgia's military response to secessionism. Later, Netarashvili's administration was implicated in some internal controversies and had not taken an active part in the politics of Abkhazia until a new chairman, Irakli Alesania, was appointed by President of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, his envoy in the peace talks over Abkhazia. Administrative divisions. The Republic of Abkhazia is divided into 7 rayons, districts, named after their primary cities: Gagra, Gadada, Sukhumi, Akamkara, Golripshi, Tkhvarchali, and Gali. These districts remain mostly unchanged since the breakup of the Soviet Union, with the exception of the Tkhvarchali district, created in 1995 from parts of the Akamkara and Gali districts. The President of the Republic appoints districts heads from those elected to the district's assemblies. There are elected village assemblies whose heads are appointed by the district's heads. The administrative subdivisions under Georgian law are identical to the ones outlined above, except for the new Tkhvarchali district. Military. The Abkhazian Armed Forces are the military of the Republic of Abkhazia. The basis of the Abkhazian Armed Forces was formed by the ethnically Abkhaz National Guard, which was established in early 1992. Most of their weapons come from the former Russian Airborne Division base in Gadada. The Abkhazian military is primarily a ground force, but includes small sea and air units. Russia deploys its own military units as part of the 7th Military Base in Abkhazia. These units are reportedly subordinate to the Russian 49th Army and include both ground elements and air defense assets. The Abkhazian Armed Forces are composed of the Abkhazian Army with a permanent force of around 5,000, but with reservists and paramilitary personnel this may increase to up to 50,000 in times of military conflict. The exact numbers and the type of equipment used remain unverifiable. The Abkhazian Navy that consists of 3 divisions based in Sukhumi, Akamchir, and Pitsunda, but the Russian Coast Guard patrols their waters, citation needed. The Abkhazian Air Force, a small unit consisting of a few fighter aircraft and helicopters. Status. Abkhazia, Transnistria, and South Ossetia are post-Soviet frozen conflict zones. These 3 states maintain friendly relations with each other and form the Community for Democracy and Rights of Nations. Russia and Nicaragua officially recognized Abkhazia after the Russo-Georgian War. Venezuela recognized Abkhazia in September 2009, but in December 2009. Nauru recognized Abkhazia, reportedly in return for $50 million in humanitarian aid from Russia. The unrecognized Republic of Transnistria and the partially recognized Republic of South Ossetia have recognized Abkhazia since 2006. Abkhazia is also a member of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, UNPO. A majority of sovereign states recognize Abkhazia as an integral part of Georgia and support its territorial integrity according to the principles of international law, although Belarus has expressed sympathy toward the recognition of Abkhazia. Some have officially noted Abkhazia as under occupation by the Russian military. The United Nations has been urging both sides to settle the dispute through diplomatic dialogue and ratifying the final status of Abkhazia in the Georgian constitution. However, the Abkhaz de facto government considers Abkhazia a sovereign country, even if it is recognized by few other countries. In early 2000, then UN Special Representative of the Secretary-General Dieter Bohlen and the group of Friends of Georgia, consisting of the representatives of Russia, the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, drafted and informally presented a document to the parties outlining a possible distribution of competencies between the Abkhaz and Georgian authorities, based on core respect for Georgian territorial integrity. The Abkhaz side, however, has never accepted the paper as a basis for negotiations. Eventually, Russia also withdrew its approval of the document. In 2005 and 2008, the Georgian government offered Abkhazia a high degree of autonomy and possible federal structure within the borders and jurisdiction of Georgia. On October 18, 2006, the People's Assembly of Abkhazia passed a resolution calling upon Russia, international organizations, and the rest of the international community to recognize Abkhaz independence on the basis that Abkhazia possesses all the properties of an independent state. The United Nations has reaffirmed the commitment of all member states to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Georgia within its internationally recognized borders and outlined the basic principles of conflict resolution, which call for immediate return of all displaced persons and for non-resumption of hostilities. Georgia accuses the Abkhaz secessionists of having conducted a deliberate campaign of ethnic cleansing of up to 250,000 Georgians, a claim supported by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, Budapest, Lisbon, and Istanbul Declaration. The UN Security Council has avoided the use of the term ethnic cleansing, but has affirmed the unacceptability of the demographic changes resulting from the conflict that on May 15, 2008, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a non-binding resolution recognizing the right of all refugees, including victims of reported ethnic cleansing, to return to Abkhazia and to retain or regain their property rights there. It regretted the attempts to alter pre-war demographic composition and called for the rapid development of a timetable to ensure the prompt voluntary return of all refugees and internally displaced persons to their homes. On March 28, 2008, the president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, unveiled his government's new proposals to Abkhazia, the broadest possible autonomy within the framework of a Georgian state, a joint free economic zone, representation in the central authorities, including the post of vice president with the right to veto Abkhaz-related decisions. The Abkhaz leader, Sergei Bagapsh, rejected these new initiatives as propaganda, leading to Georgia's complaints that this skepticism was triggered by Russia rather than by the real mood of the Abkhaz people. On July 3, 2008, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly passed a resolution at its annual session in Astana, expressing concern over Russia's recent moves in breakaway Abkhazia. Georgia accuses the Abkhaz secessionists of having conducted a deliberate campaign of ethnic cleansing of up to 250,000 Georgians, a claim supported by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, Budapest, Lisbon, and Istanbul Declaration. The UN Security Council has avoided the use of the term ethnic cleansing, but has affirmed the unacceptability of the demographic changes resulting from the conflict that on May 15, 2008, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a non-binding resolution recognizing the right of all refugees, including victims of reported ethnic cleansing, to return to Abkhazia and to retain or regain their property rights there. The resolution calls on the Russian authorities to refrain from maintaining ties with the breakaway regions in any manner that would constitute a challenge to the sovereignty of Georgia, and also urges Russia to abide by OSCE standards and generally accepted international norms with respect to the threat or use of force to resolve conflicts in relations with other participating states. On July 9, 2012, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly passed a resolution at its annual session in Monaco, underlining Georgia's territorial integrity and referring to breakaway Abkhazia and South Ossetia as occupied territories. The resolution urges the government and the parliament of the Russian Federation, as well as the de facto authorities of Abkhazia, Georgia and South Ossetia, Georgia, to allow the European Union monitoring mission unimpeded access to the occupied territories. It also says that the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly is concerned about the humanitarian situation of the displaced persons both in Georgia and in the occupied territories of Abkhazia, Georgia and South Ossetia, Georgia, as well as the denial of the right of return to their places of living. The Assembly is the parliamentary dimension of the OSCE, with 320 lawmakers from the organization's 57 participating states, including Russia. Law on the occupied territories of Georgia. In late October 2008, President Saakashvili signed into law legislation on the occupied territories passed by the Georgian parliament. The law covers the breakaway regions of Abkhazia and Tskhinvali, territories of the former South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast. The law spells out restrictions on free movement and economic activity in the territories. In particular, according to the law, foreign citizens should enter the two breakaway regions only through Georgia proper. Entry into Abkhazia should be carried out from the Zugdidi municipality and into South Ossetia from the Gori municipality. The major road leading to South Ossetia from the rest of Georgia passes through the Gori district. The legislation, however, also lists special cases in which entry into the breakaway regions will not be regarded as illegal. It stipulates that a special permit on entry into the breakaway regions can be issued if the trip there serves Georgia's state interests, peaceful resolution of the conflict, deoccupation, or humanitarian purposes. The law also bans any type of economic activity, entrepreneurial or non-entrepreneurial, if such activities require permits, licenses, or registration in accordance with Georgian legislation. It also bans air, sea, and railway communications and international transit via the regions, mineral exploration, and money transfers. The provision covering economic activities is retroactive, going back to 1990. The law says that the Russian Federation, the state that has carried out military occupation, is fully responsible for the violation of human rights in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The Russian Federation, according to the document, is also responsible for compensation of material and moral damage inflicted on Georgian citizens, stateless persons, and foreign citizens who are in Georgia and enter the occupied territories with appropriate permits. The law also says that de facto state agencies and officials operating in the occupied territories are regarded by Georgia as illegal. The law will remain in force until the full restoration of Georgian jurisdiction over the breakaway regions is realized. Status-neutral passports. According to a 2006 report, Georgia considers all residents of Abkhazia its citizens, while they see themselves as Abkhaz citizens. In the summer of 2011, the Parliament of Georgia adopted a package of legislative amendments providing for the issuance of neutral identification and travel documents to residents of Abkhazia and the former South Ossetian Autonomous Province of Georgia. The document allows traveling abroad as well as enjoying the social benefits existing in Georgia. The new neutral identification and travel documents were called neutral passports. The status-neutral passports do not carry the state symbols of Georgia. Abkhazia's foreign minister, Vyacheslav Chirikba, criticized the status-neutral passports and called their introduction unacceptable. Some Abkhazian residents with Russian passports were being denied Schengen visas. As of May 2013, neutral documents have been recognized by Japan, the Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, the United States, Bulgaria, Poland, Israel, Estonia, and Romania. According to Russian media, the president of the Republic of Abkhazia, Alexander Ankvab, threatened international organizations that accepted neutral passports, saying during a meeting with the leadership of the foreign ministry that international organizations that suggest the so-called neutral passports will leave Abkhazia. Russian involvement. During the Georgian-Abkhaz conflict, the Russian authorities and military supplied logistical and military aid to the separatist side. Today, Russia still maintains a strong political and military influence over separatist rule in Abkhazia. Russia has also issued passports to the citizens of Abkhazia since 2000, as Abkhazian passports cannot be used for international travel, and subsequently paid them retirement pensions and other monetary benefits. More than 80% of the Abkhazian population had received Russian passports by 2006. As Russian citizens living abroad, Abkhazians do not pay Russian taxes or serve in the Russian army. About 53,000 Abkhazian passports have been issued as of May 2007. Moscow, at certain times, hinted that it might recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia when Western countries recognized the independence of Kosovo, suggesting that they had created a precedent. Following Kosovo's declaration of independence, the Russian parliament released a joint statement reading, "Now that the situation in Kosovo has become an international precedent, Russia should take into account the Kosovo scenario when considering ongoing territorial conflicts." Initially, Russia continued to delay recognition of both of these republics. However, on April 16, 2008, the outgoing Russian President Vladimir Putin instructed his government to establish official ties with South Ossetia and Abkhazia, leading to Georgia's condemnation of what it described as an attempt at de facto annexation, and criticism from the European Union, NATO, and several Western governments. Later in April 2008, Russia accused Georgia of trying to exploit NATO support in order to control Abkhazia by force and announced it would increase its military presence in the region, pledging to retaliate militarily against Georgia's efforts. Georgian Prime Minister Lado Gurgenidze said Georgia will treat any additional troops in Abkhazia as aggressors. In response to the Russo-Georgian War, the Federal Assembly of Russia called an extraordinary session on August 25, 2008 to discuss the recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Following a unanimous resolution passed by both houses of the parliament calling on the Russian president to recognize the independence of the breakaway republics, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev officially recognized both on 26 August 2008. Russian recognition 228 was condemned by NATO member states, OSCE, and European Council members due to violation of territorial integrity and international law. The UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon stated that sovereign states have to decide for themselves whether they want to recognize the independence of disputed regions. Russia has begun work on the establishment of a naval base in Akhmimshire by dredging the coast to allow the passage of its larger naval vessels, as a response to the Georgian sea blockade of Abkhazia, in which the Georgian Coast Guard had been detaining ships heading to and from Abkhazia. Russia warned Georgia against ship seizures and said that a unit of Russian guard boats would provide security for ships bound for Abkhazia. The extent of Russian influence in Abkhazia has caused some locals to say that Abkhazia is under full Russian control, but they still prefer Russian influence over Georgian. International involvement. The UN has played various roles during the conflict and the peace process. A military role through its observer mission, UNAMIG, dual diplomatic roles through the Security Council and the appointment of a special envoy, succeeded by a special representative to the Secretary General, a humanitarian role, UNHCR and UNOCHA, a development role, UNDP, a human rights role, OHCHR, and a low-key capacity and confidence-building role, UNV. The UN's position has been that there will be no forcible change of international borders. Any settlement must be freely negotiated and based on autonomy for Abkhazia, legitimized by referendum under international observation once the multi-ethnic population has returned. The OSCE has increasingly engaged in dialogue with officials and civil society representatives in Abkhazia, especially from non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and the media, regarding human dimension standards in the region, and is considering a presence in Gali. The OSCE expressed concern and condemnation over the ethnic cleansing of Georgians in Abkhazia during the 1994 Budapest Summit decision, and later at the Lisbon Summit Declaration in 1996. The U.S. rejects the unilateral secession of Abkhazia and urges its integration into Georgia as an autonomous unit. In 1998, the U.S. announced its readiness to allocate up to $15 million for the rehabilitation of infrastructure in the Gali region if substantial progress is made in the peace process. USAID has already funded some humanitarian initiatives for Abkhazia. On August 22, 2006, Senator Richard Lugar, then visiting Georgia's capital Tbilisi, joined Georgian politicians in criticism of the Russian peacekeeping mission, stating that the U.S. administration supports the Georgian government's insistence on the withdrawal of Russian peacekeepers from the conflict zones in Abkhazia and the Skinvali district. On October 5, 2006, Javier Solana, the High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union, ruled out the possibility of replacing the Russian peacekeepers with the EU force that on October 10, 2006, EU South Caucasus envoy Peter Semneby noted that Russia's actions in the Georgia spy row have damaged its credibility as a neutral peacekeeper in the EU's Black Sea neighborhood. On October 13, 2006, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted a resolution based on a group of friends of the Secretary-General draft, extending the UNAMIG mission until April 15, 2007. In 1998, the U.S. announced its readiness to allocate up to $15 million for the rehabilitation of infrastructure in the Gali region if substantial progress is made in the peace process. USAID has already funded some humanitarian initiatives for Abkhazia, acknowledging that the new intense situation resulted, at least in part, from the Georgian Special Forces operation in the Upper Kotori Valley. The resolution urged the country to ensure that no troops unauthorized by the Moscow ceasefire agreement were present in that area. It urged the leadership of the Abkhaz side to address seriously the need for a dignified, secure return of refugees and internally displaced persons, and to reassure the local population in the Gali district that their residency rights and identity would be respected. The Georgian side is once again urged to address seriously legitimate Abkhaz security concerns, to avoid steps that could be seen as threatening, and to refrain from militant rhetoric and provocative actions, especially in Upper Kotori Valley. Calling on both parties to follow up on dialogue initiatives, it further urged them to comply fully with all previous agreements regarding nonviolence and confidence building, in particular those concerning the separation of forces. Regarding the disputed role of the peacekeepers from the Commonwealth of Independent States, CS, the Council stressed the importance of close, effective cooperation between UNAMIG and that force, and looked to all sides to continue to extend the necessary cooperation to them. At the same time, the document reaffirmed the commitment of all member states to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Georgia within its internationally recognized borders. The Halo Trust, an international nonprofit organization that specializes in the removal of the debris of war, has been active in Abkhazia since 1999 and has completed the removal of landmines in Sukhumi and Gali districts. It declared Abkhazia mine-free in 2011. France-based international NGO Premier Urgence has been implementing a food security program to support the vulnerable populations affected by the frozen conflict for almost 10 years. Russia does not allow the European Union monitoring mission in Georgia, EUMM, to enter Abkhazia. Recognition. Abkhazia has been recognized as an independent state by only 5 states: Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Nauru, and Syria. Georgia and other countries consider Abkhazia as Georgia's sovereign territory. Russia was the first country to officially recognize Abkhazia, which it did after the 2008 Russo-Georgian War. After the Russian recognition, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Nauru, Vanuatu, and Tuvalu soon followed suit and recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. However, in 2013 and 2014, Vanuatu and Tuvalu scrapped their recognition. Russia invested a significant amount of money in a diplomatic strategy to promote the recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia and display its soft power. However, Russia appeared to have stopped investing in the recognition project after 2014. One possible reason could be the worsening of Russia's financial situation following the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War in 2014 and the subsequent imposition of international sanctions on Russia. Consequently, Abkhazia launched its own campaign to strengthen its diplomatic relations with foreign countries and present itself as an independent actor. As a part of these efforts, Abkhaz officials paid official visits to numerous countries, including China, Italy, Turkey, and Israel. Additionally, they held high-level meetings with political representatives from South Africa, Jordan, and El Salvador, and sent diplomatic notes to different countries, including Egypt, France, Guatemala, and Sri Lanka. This campaign reached its peak in 2017, but subsequently decreased and largely halted with the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. That IT was largely unsuccessful and ended in failure, as Syria remains the only country that has recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia since 2009. The following is a list of political entities that formally recognize Abkhazia. UN member states. Russia recognized Abkhazia on August 26, 2008, after the Russo-Georgian War. Nicaragua recognized Abkhazia on September 5, 2008. Venezuela recognized Abkhazia on September 10, 2009. Nauru recognized Abkhazia on December 15, 2009. Syria recognized Abkhazia on 29 May 2018, but the recognition was not rescinded by the new government after the overthrow of Bashar Assad. Partially recognized and unrecognized territories. South Ossetia recognized Abkhazia on November 17, 2006. Transnistria recognized Abkhazia on November 17, 2006. Former recognition. Vanuatu recognized Abkhazia on 23 May 2011, but withdrew recognition on May 20, 2013. Tuvalu recognized Abkhazia on September 18, 2011, but withdrew recognition on March 31, 2014. Republic of Artsakh recognized Abkhazia on 17 November 2006. Self-proclaimed Republic of Artsakh dissolved in 2023. Proposals on entry into Russian Federation. Since the 1992 to 1993 war in Abkhazia, there have been several proposals voiced by the separatist Abkhaz government and the Russian government for Abkhazia to become part of the Russian Federation, which have been opposed by the Georgian government and the government in exile of Autonomous Republic of Abkhazia. One of the early proposals was voiced before the war. In March 1989, when the Abkhaz ethno-nationalist organization Ajalara issued the LYKHNY appeal calling for Abkhazia to become part of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. This is thought to be a starting point for the Abkhazia conflict between the separatists and local Georgian population in Abkhazia. After the war, on November 18, 1993, a month after its ending and ethnic cleansing of Georgians in Abkhazia, the leader of Abkhazia, Vladislav Artzimba, proposed to hold a referendum to join the Russian Federation in 2001. A similar desire was voiced by Abkhazia's Prime Minister, Andry Georgieva, who said that Abkhazia was preparing to join Russia and that it was going to hold a referendum on that issue. In October 2022, in an interview to the Russian TV, President of Abkhazia Aslan Bazania declared Abkhazia's readiness to host a Russian Navy and join the Russia-Belarus Union State. However, the proposal has been criticized as impractical since Belarus does not recognize Abkhazia as a sovereign state and considers it to be part of Georgia. In August 2023, Deputy Chair of Russian Security Council Dmitry Medvedev also voiced support for these proposals, accusing Georgia of escalating tensions by its potential membership to the NATO and saying that there were good reasons for Abkhazia and South Ossetia to join Russia. Medvedev also mocked Georgia's desire to restore its territorial integrity, saying that Georgia can only be united as part of Russia. Georgia criticized the proposals for Abkhazia's entry into the Russian Federation and Union State. In 2014, Georgia's foreign ministry issued a statement calling the Russia-Abkhazia Treaty on Integration a de facto annexation. Economy. The economy of Abkhazia is integrated with Russia as outlined in a bilateral agreement published in November 2014. The country uses the Russian ruble as its currency, and the two countries share a common economic and customs union. Abkhazia has experienced a modest economic upswing since the 2008 South Ossetia War and Russia's subsequent recognition of Abkhazia's independence. About half of Abkhazia's state budget is financed with aid money from Russia. Tourism is a key industry, and According to Abkhazia's authorities, almost 1 million tourists, mainly from Russia, came to Abkhazia in 2007. Abkhazia exports wine and fruits, especially tangerines and hazelnuts. Electricity is largely supplied by the Inguri hydroelectric power station located on the Inguri River between Abkhazia and Georgia proper, and operated jointly by both parties. In the first half of 2012, the principal trading partners of Abkhazia were Russia, 64%, and Turkey, 18%. The CS economic sanctions imposed on Abkhazia in 1996 are still formally in force, but Russia announced on March 6, 2008 that it would no longer participate in them, declaring them outdated, impeding the socioeconomic development of the region and causing unjustified hardship for the people of Abkhazia. Russia also called on other CS members to undertake similar steps, but met with protests from Tbilisi and lack of support from the other CS countries. Despite the controversial status of the territory and its damaged infrastructure, tourism in Abkhazia grew following the Russian recognition of Abkhazia independence in 2008 due to the arrival of Russian tourists. In 2009, the number of Russian tourists in Abkhazia increased by 20%, and the total number of Russian tourists reached 1 million. After the tourist boom, many Russian businesses began to invest money in Abkhazian tourist infrastructure. With the main highway of the country being rebuilt in 2014, many damaged hotels in Gagra are either being restored or demolished. In 2014, 1.16 million Russian tourists visited Abkhazia. Demographics. According to the last census in 2011, Abkhazia had 240,705 inhabitants. The Department of Statistics of Georgia estimated Abkhazia's population to be approximately 179,000 in 2003 and 178,000 in 2005, the last year when such estimates were published in Georgia. Encyclopedia Britannica estimates the population in 2007 at 180,000, and the International Crisis Group estimated Abkhazia's total population in 2006 to be between 157,000 and 190,000, or between 180,000 and 220,000 as estimated by UNDP. 1998. Ethnicity. The ethnic composition of Abkhazia has played a central role in the Georgian-Abkhazian conflict. The 1992 to 1993 war with Georgia resulted in the expulsion and flight of over half of the republic's population, which had numbered 525,061 in the 1989 census. The population of Abkhazia remains ethnically very diverse, even after the 1992 to 1993 war. At present, the population of Abkhazia is mainly made up of ethnic Abkhaz, 50.7% according to the 2011 census. Russians, Armenians, Georgians, mostly Mingrelians but also Svans, and Greeks. Other ethnicities include Ukrainians, Belarusians, Ossetians, Tatars, Turks, Roma, and Estonians. Greeks constituted a significant minority in the area in the early 1920s at 50,000 and remained a major ethnic group until 1945 when they were deported to Central Asia. Under the Soviet Union, the Russian, Armenian, and Georgian populations grew faster than the Abkhaz population due to large-scale and forced migration, especially under the rule of Joseph Stalin and Lavrentiy Beria. At the time of the 1989 census, Abkhazia's Georgian population numbered 239,872, forming around 45.7% of the population, and the Armenian population was 77,000 due to ethnic cleansing and displacement due to people fleeing the 1992 to 1993 war, the Georgian population. And to a lesser extent, the Russian and Armenian populations has greatly declined. In 2003 Armenians formed the second largest minority group in Abkhazia, closely matching the Georgians, numbering 44,869 by the time of the 2011 census. Georgians formed the second largest minority group with a population of 46 for 55 despite the official numbers. Unofficial sources estimate that the Abkhaz and Armenian communities are roughly equal in number. The 1992 to 1993 war with Georgia resulted in the expulsion and flight of over half of the republic's population, which had numbered 525,061 in the 1989 census. The population of Abkhazia remains ethnically very diverse, even after the 1992 to 1993 war. At present, the population of Abkhazia is mainly made up of ethnic Abkhaz, 50.7% according to the 2011 census, Russians, Armenians, Georgians, mostly Mingrelians but also Svans, and Greeks. Other ethnicities include Ukrainians, Belarusians, Ossetians, Tatars, Turks, Roma, and Estonians. In the wake of the Syrian civil war, Abkhazia granted refugee status to a few hundred Syrians with Abkhaz, Abkhazan, and Circassian ancestry. Facing a growing Armenian community, this move has been linked with the wish of the ruling Abkhaz, who have often been in the minority on their territory, to tilt the demographic balance in favor of the titular nation. Diaspora. Thousands of Abkhaz, known as Muhajirin, were exiled to the Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century after resisting the Russian conquest of the Caucasus. Today, Turkey is home to the world's largest Abkhaz diaspora community. Size estimates vary. Diaspora leaders say 1 million people. Abkhaz estimates range from 150,000 to 500,000. Language. The official language of the Republic of Abkhazia shall be the Abkhazian language. The Russian language, equally with the Abkhazian language, shall be recognized as a language of state and other institutions. The state shall guarantee the right to freely use the mother language for all the ethnic groups residing in Abkhazia. The languages spoken in Abkhazia are Abkhaz, Russian, the Kartvelian languages Mingrelian and Svan, Armenian, and Greek. The Autonomous Republic passed a law in 2007 defining the Abkhaz language as the only state language of Abkhazia. As such, Abkhaz is a required language for legislative and executive council debates, with translation from into Russian. And at least half of the text of all magazines and newspapers must be in Abkhaz. Despite the official status of Abkhaz, the dominance of other languages within Abkhazia, especially Russian, is so great that experts called it an endangered language in 2004 that during the Soviet era, language instruction would begin in schools in Abkhaz, only to switch to Russian for the majority of required schooling. The government of the Republic is attempting to institute Abkhaz-only primary education, but there has been limited success due to a lack of facilities and educational materials. The primary schools in Kartvelian-speaking areas switched from Georgian to Russian in 2016. Religio. A majority of inhabitants of Abkhazia are Christian, Eastern Orthodox, see also Abkhazian Orthodox Church, and Armenian Apostolic, while a significant minority are Sunni Muslim. The Abkhaz native religion has undergone a strong revival in recent decades. There's a very small number of adherents of Judaism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and new religious movements. The Jehovah's Witnesses organization has officially been banned since 1995, though the decree is not currently enforced. According to the Constitution of Abkhazia, the adherents of all religions have equal rights before the law. According to a survey held in 2003, 60% of respondents identified themselves as Christian, 16% as Muslim, 8% as atheist or irreligious, 8% as adhering to the traditional Abkhazian religion or as pagan, 2% as follower of other religions, and 6% as undecided. Nationality issues. Passportization by Russian Federation. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, many Abkhazians kept their Soviet passports, even after a decade, and used them to eventually apply for Russian citizenship. Before 2002, Russian law allowed residents of former Soviet Union to apply for citizenship if they had not become citizens of their newly independent states. The procedure was extremely complex. The new citizenship law of Russia, adopted on May 31, 2002, introduced a simplified procedure of citizenship acquisition for former citizens of the Soviet Union regardless of their place of residence. In Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the application process was simplified even further, and people could apply even without leaving their homes. Russian non-governmental organizations with close ties to Russian officialdom simply took their papers to a nearby Russian city for processing. Abkhazians began mass acquisition of Russian passports in 2002. It is reported that the public organization, the Congress of Russian Communities of Abkhazia, started collecting Abkhazians' Soviet air travel documents. It then sent them to a consular department specially set up by Russian foreign ministry officials in the city of Sochi. After they were checked, Abkhazian applicants were granted Russian citizenship. By June 25, 2002, an estimated 150,000 people in Abkhazia had acquired the new passports, joining 50,000 who already possessed Russian citizenship. The Sukhum authorities, although officially not involved in the registration for Russian nationality process, openly encouraged it. Government officials said privately that President Putin's administration agreed with the passport acquisition during Abkhazia's Prime Minister Georginia's visit to Moscow in May 2002. When the passportization policy was launched in 2002, even Russia recognized Abkhazia as part of Georgia at that time. Russia's extraterritorial naturalization practice in South Ossetia and Abkhazia constituted an intervention contrary to international law, and it violated Georgia's territorial sovereignty. The passportization caused outrage in Tbilisi, worsening its already shaky relations with Russia. The Georgian Foreign Ministry issued a statement insisting that Abkhazians were citizens of Georgia and calling the passport allocation an unprecedented illegal campaign. President Eduard Shevardnadze said that he would be asking his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, for an explanation. The Speaker of Parliament, Nino Burjanad, said that she would raise the matter at the forthcoming OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. February 1st, 2011 was the last day in the post-Soviet era when a passport of USSR was valid for crossing the Russian-Abkhaz border. According to the staff of Abkhazia's passport and visa service, there were about 2,000 to 3,000 mostly elderly people left with Soviet passports who had no chance of acquiring new documents. These people were not able to get Russian citizenship, but they can first get an internal Abkhaz passport and then a traveling passport to visit Russia. Issue of ethnic Georgians. In 2005, citing the need to integrate ethnic Georgian residents of eastern districts of Abkhazia, the then leadership of Abkhazia showed signs of a softening stance towards granting of citizenship to the residents of Gali, Akamshire, and Tverchely districts. According to the Abkhazian law on citizenship, ethnic Abkhazians, regardless of place of residence, can become Abkhaz citizens. Those who are not ethnic Abkhazians are eligible for citizenship if they lived in Abkhazia for at least 5 years prior to the adoption of the Act of Independence in October 1999. This provision aimed at creating a legal hurdle in obtaining Abkhaz passports for those ethnic Georgians who fled Abkhazia as a result of 1992 to 1993 armed conflict and who then returned to the Gali district. Abkhazian legislation forbids citizens of Abkhazia from holding dual citizenship with any other state apart from Russia. Ethnic Georgians who have returned to the Gali district and want to obtain Abkhaz passports, according to Abkhazian law, should undergo lengthy procedures which also include a requirement to submit documented proof that they renounce their Georgian citizenship. President Bagapsh was inclined to regard Georgians in Gali as Georgianized Abkhazians. According to Bagapsh, these were actually ethnic Abkhaz, people who were Georgianized during the long process of the Georgianization of Abkhazia that culminated during the rule of Joseph Stalin and Lavrentiy Beria. So in his official speeches, Bagapsh often added the Gali Georgians to population estimates of the Abkhaz, disregarding the fact that they still thought of themselves as ethnic Georgians rather than Abkhaz. This provision aimed at creating a legal hurdle in obtaining Abkhaz passports for those ethnic Georgians who fled Abkhazia as a result of 1992 to 1993 armed conflict and who then returned to the Gali district. Abkhazian legislation forbids citizens of Abkhazia from holding dual citizenship with any other state apart from Russia. In early 2013, the process of passportization of ethnic Georgians came under the scrutiny of Abkhaz opposition groups, who turned this issue into one of the central topics of the breakaway region's internal politics, and issuing of passports was suspended in May. Opposition claimed that massive passportization involving granting citizenship to ethnic Georgians in eastern districts was fraught with risk of losing sovereignty and territorial integrity. According to Abkhazia Press, Stanislav Lakoba, secretary of Abkhaz Security Council, said that we are facing the process of the total Georgianization of Abkhazia. Pressures have been placed upon teachers in areas of Abkhazia which retain large Georgian populations to abandon the use of the Georgian language in education and adopt Russian textbooks. This provision aimed at creating a legal hurdle in obtaining Abkhaz passports for those ethnic Georgians who fled Abkhazia as a result of 1992 to 1993 armed conflict and who then returned to the Gali district. Abkhazian legislation forbids citizens of Abkhazia from holding dual citizenship with any other state apart from Russia. On September 18, 2013, the Parliament of Republic of Abkhazia adopted a resolution instructing the prosecutor's office to carry out a sweeping probe into passport offices of the Interior Ministry, and where wrongdoings were found in the distribution of passports, to refer those violations to the Ministry of Internal Affairs for annulment of illegally issued passports. Abkhaz officials announced that a significant number of residents of Gali, Akhimshire, and Tverchli districts received Abkhaz passports while at the same time retaining their Georgian citizenship, which constituted a violation of the law on Abkhaz citizenship. According to the Abkhaz officials, more than 26,000 passports were distributed in Gali, Tverchli, and Akhimshire districts, including about 23,000 of which were given out since Russian recognition of Abkhazia's independence in August 2008. These political debates have caused concerns in the ethnic Georgian population of Abkhazia, who reside mainly in Gali district, that they would be stripped of Abkhazian citizenship and thus forced to leave Abkhazia again. In October 2013, Alexander Ankvab signed a document ordering the firing of Stanislav Lakoba. The document did not state any reason for the decision, but Lakoba saw it as related to his political position on granting citizenship to Georgians living in Gali. Lakoba claimed that, according to data from the Abkhaz Security Council, 129 local people in Gali fought against Abkhazia. Local political parties and the Coordination Council of Civil Organizations expressed concern about Lakoba's dismissal. They claimed that by dismissing him, the president made an illegal process legal, giving Abkhazian passports to Georgian citizens. Education. Until the 19th century, young people from Abkhazia usually received their education mainly at religious schools, Muslims at madrasas and Christians at seminaries, although a small number of children from wealthy families had opportunity to travel to foreign countries for education. The first modern educational institutions, both schools and colleges, in Abkhazia were established in the late 19th, early 20th centuries and rapidly grew until the second half of the 20th century. By the middle of the 20th century, Sukhumi had become a home for large educational institutions, both higher education institutions and technical vocational education and training, TVT colleges, and largest students' community in Abkhazia. For example, the number of college students grew from few dozens in the 1920s to several thousands in the 1980s. According to the official statistical data, Abkhazia has 12 TVT colleges. As of 2019, EST, providing education and vocational training to youth mostly in the capital city, though there are several colleges in all major district centers. Independent international assessments suggest that these colleges train in about 20 different specialties, attracting between 1,000 and 1,300 young people annually, aged between 16 and 29, as of 2019 EST. The largest colleges are as follows. Culture. The Apswara, the Abkhaz Code of Honor, is very stringent regarding hospitality. One of its principles is to respect guests even if they have committed crimes against the host. The written Abkhaz literature appeared relatively recently, in the beginning of the 20th century. However, Abkhaz share the Nart sagas, a series of tales about mythical heroes, with other Caucasian peoples. The Abkhaz alphabet was created in the 19th century. The first newspaper in Abkhaz, called Abkhazia and edited by Dmitry Gilya, appeared in 1917. Arguably the most famous Abkhaz writers are Fazil Iskander, who wrote mostly in Russian, and Bagrat Shinkaba, a poet and writer. Sports. Football remains the most popular sport in Abkhazia. Other popular sports include basketball, boxing, and wrestling. The national basketball team of Abkhazia played its first game with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus basketball team on May 27, 2015, which Abkhaz team won by 76-59. The Abkhaz basketball team, Apsny, also plays in the Russian Basketball League's third tier in Krasnodar Krai. Abkhazia has had its own amateur football league called the Abkhazian Premier League, but it has no international football union membership. In total, there are 19 Abkhazian football clubs across the two leagues. In 2016, it hosted and won the CON-IFA World Football Cup. Since the early 2000s, tennis has become increasingly popular among school-aged children in Abkhazia. Several tennis players from Sukhumi participated as the national competitions in Russia and played at major international competitions under the Russian flag. For example, tennis player Alan Avidzba participated at the Davis Cup in 2016, and Amina Anchba won a silver medal at an international tournament in Turkey in 2017. In fact, according to the official information from the tennis portal, the highest career achievement of Amina Anchba was 278th place in the ranking among women in 2021.